Welcome to Legacy of Blood, and this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Missouri. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1867. The American Civil War had ended just 2 years prior, leaving the nation wounded and struggling to heal. In the rugged, isolated hills of the Missouri Ozarks, most folks were simply trying to rebuild their lives. Roads were primitive then, little more than dirt paths carved into the wilderness, connecting scattered settlements. For travelers, the journey through these hills could take days, and safe shelter was a blessing sought after sunset. Along one such road, approximately 17 miles northeast of Springfield in Webster County, stood a modest cabin that many travelers remembered passing. It wasn't marked on any maps, but locals knew it as the Stillwell Place, named after the two brothers who had settled there sometime around 1863. The cabin sat back from the road about 50 yards, partially obscured by a stand of oak trees, with a small hand-painted sign that simply read, "Water and rest for weary travelers." The Stillwell brothers, Elias, the elder at 37 and Jeremiah, 34, were known to offer water from their well and sometimes a meal or place to sleep for those passing through. They kept to themselves mostly, though they would occasionally venture into the nearby town of Marshfield for supplies. Neighbors described them as quiet men who didn't cause no trouble. The brothers had arrived during the turmoil of the war, and like many who appeared in those chaotic times, few questioned their origins or past. On December 12, 1867, a postal carrier named Thomas Weston was making his route through Webster County when a heavy snow began to fall. According to the statement he later provided to county officials, he sought shelter at the Stillwell cabin, as he had done twice before. What he discovered there would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in Ozark history, one that, despite initial scrutiny, would ultimately be classified as an unsolved cold case for nearly a century. What follows is a documented account assembled from county records, newspaper articles from the Springfield, Missouri Weekly Patriot, personal testimonies, and evidence collected by the Webster County Sheriff's Department in 1867 and 1868. Some records were later recovered during a courthouse renovation in 1952, providing additional details previously thought lost. As the winter of 1867 settled over the Ozarks, no one suspected that the Stillwell brothers had been serving travelers something far more sinister than water. Their hospitality concealed secrets that would haunt Webster County for generations. Thomas Weston's postal route took him through some of the most remote parts of the county. At 31 years old, he was no stranger to the hardships of the trail, having served as a scout during the war. The snow was coming down heavily that December afternoon, and visibility was poor. He later testified that he almost missed the turn to the Stillwell Place, only noticing it when his horse stopped suddenly near the path. The cabin looked different somehow, Weston stated in his report. No smoke from the chimney despite the cold, no lantern in the window like there usually was. He approached cautiously, noting that there were no fresh tracks in the snow, which struck him as odd. The Stillwells rarely left their property during winter months. Weston claimed he called out several times before trying the door, which he found unlocked. The interior was dark and unusually cold. A half-eaten meal sat on the table. The food hardened with frost. The fireplace contained only cold ashes. Most striking, according to Weston, was the silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes a man's ears ring, he wrote. A search of the cabin revealed no sign of the brothers. Their coats still hung by the door. Their rifles remained mounted above the fireplace. It appeared they had simply vanished in the middle of a meal. Weston, concerned and confused, decided to continue to Marshfield despite the worsening weather to report his discovery to Sheriff James Harrington. Initial assumptions were simple. Perhaps the brothers had gone hunting and gotten caught in the storm. Maybe they had relatives nearby they'd gone to visit. But something about the abandoned meal troubled the sheriff enough to assemble a search party the following day. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, marked the beginning of a mystery that would only deepen with time. The Stillwell brothers had appeared in Webster County during the summer of 1863, a time when the war had turned the Ozarks into a lawless frontier. Missouri, a border state with divided loyalties, saw some of the most vicious guerrilla fighting of the conflict. Amid this chaos, two brothers purchasing a plot of land and building a cabin raised few eyebrows. According to land records recovered in 1952, Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell bought their property from a widow named Margaret Holloway, whose husband had been killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. They paid in gold coins, which was unusual enough to be mentioned in the deed. The brothers claimed to be from Kentucky, though they offered little else about their background. Martha Simmons, who ran the general store in Marshfield at the time, recalled the brothers in a journal found among her personal effects after her death in 1881. "The Stillwell men keep to themselves, but are always proper in their dealings," she wrote. "The younger one, Jeremiah, has a nervous manner about him, always watching the door. The elder speaks for them both most times. They purchase large quantities of coffee, salt, and other preserving agents." When asked, Elias said, "They smoke meat to last the winter, though I never seen them buy much in the way of livestock." The brothers quickly established a reputation for offering clean water to travelers. Their well, dug deeper than most in the area, provided cool, clear water even during dry spells. Within a year, they had added a small lean to shelter where travelers could rest if needed. By 1865, they occasionally offered meals for a small fee or trade goods. Jacob Miller, a cattle driver who used the road frequently, gave a statement in January 1868 that sheds light on the brothers' operation. "They'd have stew ready most days. Good hearty stuff. Said they hunted their own meat. Never saw them do much farming, though they had a small garden patch. The older one, Elias, he'd make conversation, while the younger one tended to the horses or fetched water. Looking back, I can't recall ever seeing any other travelers there when I stopped, though they spoke of having many visitors." The Stillwells seemed to exemplify the frontier hospitality necessary for survival in such isolated regions. Their establishment was modest, but provided a welcome respite for those traveling the difficult road between Springfield and Point's northeast. Nothing in their observed behavior suggested anything amiss. Yet, after the brothers' disappearance, a thorough search of their property would reveal troubling inconsistencies in the peaceful image they had cultivated. Sheriff Harrington's search party arrived at the Stillwell property on December 13, 1867. The snowfall had stopped, leaving 8 inches of pristine white covering the landscape. 6 men, including the sheriff and Thomas Weston, carefully examined the cabin and surrounding area. The official report filed with the county clerk and recovered during the 1952 renovation detailed their findings. No signs of struggle within the dwelling. Brothers' personal effects appear undisturbed. Unusual discovery of ledger book beneath floorboard under Elias Stillwell's bed. Book contains names, dates, and notations of value received. Though meaning unclear, some pages appear to have been removed. This ledger would become a central piece of evidence, though its full significance wasn't immediately apparent. It contained 37 entries dating from October 1863 to November 1867. each with a name, date, and cryptic notations about items of value. Some entries were marked with a simple X. The search extended to the property's outbuildings, a small barn, a smokehouse, and a storage cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin. The barn contained a single mule and evidence of at least 2 horses now missing. The smokehouse held several cuts of meat, which the searchers initially assumed to be venison or pork. It was the cellar that yielded the first truly disturbing discovery. Sheriff Harrington's report describes it as follows. Root cellar extends approximately 15 ft into hillside. Wooden shelves contain preserved goods consistent with normal household stores. However, rear wall appears to have been recently excavated, revealing narrow tunnel. Tunnel extends additional 27 terminating in chamber, roughly 8 ft by 10 ft in dimension. Chamber contains numerous personal effects, watches, rings, clothing items, papers. All appear to belong to different individuals. Most troubling discovery, 32 pairs of boots and shoes of varying sizes, some showing considerable wear, others appearing nearly new. The collection of personal items was extensive enough to suggest they had been gathered over several years. None of the items matched descriptions of the Stillwell brothers' known possessions. The implication was clear. These belongings had likely been taken from others, presumably travelers who had stopped at the cabin. Yet no bodies were found, no blood evidence. Nothing to conclusively prove violence had occurred. The most incriminating evidence was circumstantial. Why would the brothers have a hidden chamber filled with strangers' belongings? The search party expanded their efforts, combing the surrounding woods and checking the well. But the heavy snow hampered their progress. Sheriff Harrington ordered the property sealed and posted guards to prevent a tampering with potential evidence, while he returned to Marshfield to organize a more thorough investigation. Word spread quickly through the county. The mysterious disappearance of the Stillwell brothers, combined with the discovery of the hidden chamber, created a sensation. The Springfield, Missouri Weekly Patriot ran a front-page story on December 17, 1867 with the headline, "Strange Disappearance in Webster County, Foul Play Suspected." As winter's grip tightened on the Ozarks, residents began to recall details about the Stillwell brothers that had seemed insignificant before, but now took on sinister overtones. The Stillwell cabin stood empty and silent through the winter of 1867 to 68. Sheriff Harrington had it locked and regularly patrolled, though few locals ventured near the property after rumors began to spread. The investigation continued despite the challenges of the season, with Harrington interviewing anyone who had dealings with the brothers. A more detailed examination of the ledger book found under the floorboards provided the first substantial clues. Each entry followed a pattern, a name, a date, a notation about items of value, watches, coins, a fine coat, etc., and occasionally details about a destination. Entries marked with an X included an additional notation about the quality of goods. The final entry, dated November 29, 1867, read, J. Hammond, Springfield Merchant, gold timepiece of 37 notes, quality goods. X. Sheriff Harrington Cross referenced these names with reports of missing persons and found several matches. Joseph Hammond, a Springfield merchant, had indeed been reported missing by his family after failing to return from a business trip to St. Louis in late November. Similarly, William Cooper, listed in an entry from July 1867, had disappeared while traveling to visit relatives in Springfield. The implications of these matches were disturbing, but still circumstantial. Without bodies or witnesses, proving that the Stillwell brothers had been involved in disappearances remained challenging. Throughout January and February of 1868, Sheriff Harrington meticulously compiled a list of all travelers reported missing along the routes near the Stillwell property. The list eventually contained 23 names dating back to late 1863, shortly after the brothers had established themselves in the area. One name on the list proved particularly significant. Reverend Michael Donovan, a circuit preacher known to travel throughout the Ozarks, had disappeared in April 1866 while journeying from Springfield to Lebanon. His name appeared in the ledger with the notation, "Man of Cloth." Silver cross, few coins, books of no value. Ex-Reverend Donovan's congregation in Lebanon had conducted extensive searches when he failed to arrive, but no trace of him had been found. The discovery of his name in the ledger prompted a renewed search focusing specifically on the areas around the Stillwell property. On February 23, 1868, during a brief, Sheriff Harrington's deputies found a shallow grave approximately half a mile from the cabin, concealed in a thicket of brambles. The grave contained the remains of a man wearing the tattered remnants of clerical clothing. A silver cross mentioned in the ledger entry was notably absent. The discovery of Reverend Donovan's remains provided the first concrete evidence that the Stillwell brothers had been involved in at least one disappearance. However, the condition of the remains raised troubling questions. According to Dr. Hayes's examination notes, the body showed evidence of extensive post-mortem processing. Flesh removed from majority of bones with precision, suggesting knowledge of anatomy. Long bones broken at ends in manner consistent with marrow extraction. This grim finding suggested something far more disturbing than simple robbery and murder. It hinted at practices so depraved that even hardened frontier lawmen were reluctant to consider the implications. In March 1868, when the ground had thawed enough for more extensive digging, Sheriff Harrington organized a thorough search of the property. County records indicate that 20 men participated systematically excavating areas around the cabin, barn, and cellar. What they discovered was described in clinical terms in the official report, but newspaper accounts were more explicit. The Springfield, Missouri Weekly Patriot's March 19, 1868 edition reported grim discovery at Stillwell Farm. Human remains unearthed. According to the official record, investigators found human remains in 3 locations on the property. In a deep pit behind the barn, scattered in the wooded area approximately 200 yards northwest of the cabin, and most disturbing, sealed within the walls of the smokehouse. Forensic science was primitive in 1868, but Dr. William Hayes, the county physician who examined the remains, estimated they belonged to at least 7 different individuals. His notes preserved in the county archives indicate that some bones showed evidence of being processed with tools similar to those used in butchering animals. The most damning evidence came from the smokehouse. Among the hanging meats that the search party had initially assumed to be venison or pork, Dr. Hayes identified cuts that were unmistakably human in origin. His report states simply, certain preserved meats appear to be of human derivation, prepared in a manner suggesting knowledge of anatomy and preservation techniques. The implications were horrifying. The Stillwell brothers had apparently been killing travelers, taking their valuables, most unthinkably processing their remains as food, which they then served to subsequent travelers who stopped at their cabin. Yet, the brothers themselves were still missing. No trace of Elias or Jeremiah Stillwell was found during the search, leaving investigators to wonder if they had fled or perhaps met with violence themselves. The abandoned meal on their table remained an unexplained detail. The case took another turn in April 1868 when a man named Theodore Palmer came forward with information. Palmer, a trapper who often worked the remote areas of the county, claimed to have encountered Jeremiah Stillwell on December 11, 1867, the day before the brothers' disappearance was discovered. I was checking my lines up near Beaver Creek, maybe 5 miles north of their place, Palmer stated in his affidavit. Saw a man on horseback leading another horse with a bundle tied to it. Recognized him as the younger Stillwell brother. He seemed in a hurry, didn't stop to talk like he normally would, just nodded and kept riding north. Didn't think much of it until I heard about them going missing. Palmer's statement suggested that at least Jeremiah Stillwell had left the property deliberately taking provisions with him. This contradicted the scene at the cabin with its half-eaten meal and abandoned personal items. Had Jeremiah fled while Elias remained? Had Elias been a victim of his own brother? Or was there some other explanation for the seemingly contradictory evidence? Sheriff Harrington expanded the search to areas north of the county, sending telegrams to authorities in neighboring regions with descriptions of the Stillwell brothers. No confirmed sightings were reported. As the investigation proceeded through the spring and summer of 1868, more details emerged about the brothers' background, or lack thereof. Attempts to trace their claimed Kentucky origins proved fruitless. No records of Elias or Jeremiah Stillwell could be found in Kentucky or surrounding states. Their past before arriving in Webster County remained a blank slate. This lack of verifiable history raised the possibility that Stillwell was an assumed name, perhaps adopted to obscure a criminal past elsewhere. Sheriff Harrington sent inquiries to law enforcement in multiple states, seeking information about similar crimes or suspects matching the brothers' descriptions. Another discovery added to the growing body of evidence against the brothers. In the hidden chamber, where personal belongings had been found, investigators located a small journal wedged behind a loose stone in the wall. The journal, apparently belonging to Jeremiah Stillwell, contained entries dating from 1864 to 1866. Most entries were mundane notes about weather or chores, but several contained disturbing references. One entry from August 1864 read, "E says the stew needs more salt. Travelers don't notice any difference. Sometimes I wonder if they suspect. The well keeps our secret." Another dated April 1865 stated, "3 men today, Army deserters." E said, "Too risky. But they had good boots and a fine rifle. No one will look for them. Used the special herbs in their coffee." These cryptic entries suggested not only that the brothers had been killing travelers for years, but that they had developed methods to incapacitate their victims, possibly using poison. The reference to the well was particularly disturbing, as it hinted that evidence might be hidden there. Sheriff Harrington ordered the well to be drained and examined. The task proved difficult and dangerous, with the well extending over 60 feet into the limestone beneath the property. When workers finally reached the bottom, they found a layer of silt and debris approximately 3 feet deep. Among the items recovered from the well were numerous small bones later identified as finger and toe bones, several teeth, buttons, a gold wedding band inscribed with the initials MH to JH 1858, and a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be human hair of various colors tied with thread into neat bundles. Dr. Hayes examined these findings and concluded that the well had likely been used to dispose of certain remains that were not processed for other purposes. His report noted that the preservation of these items suggested they had been in the well for varying lengths of time, some possibly as long as 3 years. The discovery in the well provided further evidence of the brothers' crimes, but still left many questions unanswered. The most pressing remained what had happened to Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell. By August 1868, with no further leads and the brothers still missing, the active investigation began to wind down. Sheriff Harrington maintained that the case remained open, but resources were redirected to more pressing matters. The Stillwell property, considered a scene of horrific crimes, remained abandoned, the county unable to legally dispose of it, without resolution regarding its owners. The story of the Stillwell brothers and their gruesome hospitality quickly entered local folklore. Parents warned children to be wary of strangers offering food or shelter. Travelers through the area gave the property a wide berth, crossing themselves as they passed. The cabin itself began to deteriorate, vegetation gradually reclaiming the cleared land around it. For almost a century, the case would remain officially unsolved, though locals had little doubt about the brothers' guilt. The question of their fate, however, continued to provoke speculation and debate. Some believed they had escaped justice, fleeing to the Western Territories or perhaps even overseas. Others theorized that they had fallen victim to one of their intended targets, a traveler who had discovered their true nature and turned the tables on his would-be killers. A third theory, whispered rather than spoken aloud, suggested that the brothers had ultimately turned on each other, their partnership dissolving into murderous conflict. This theory gained some support from the scene at the cabin. The half-eaten meal, the abandoned belongings, which hinted at a sudden and unexpected end to their operation. Whatever the truth, the Stillwell brothers and their terrible crimes faded into history, becoming just another dark legend of the Ozark Hills. For decades, the case remained closed but unsolved. The brothers' fate unknown and their victims largely forgotten. The Stillwell case might have remained merely a dark footnote in Ozark history, if not for Clarence Thornton, a history professor at Missouri State University, then Southwest Missouri State College, who developed an interest in unsolved crimes of the region. In 1952, while researching for a book on frontier justice, Thornton requested access to Webster County's archived records. During a renovation of the Webster County Courthouse that same year, workers discovered a sealed compartment in the basement containing documents thought lost in a fire in 1892. Among these were additional records relating to the Stillwell case, including detailed inventories of items found in the hidden chamber and several photographs taken at the scene, some of the earliest crime scene photography in Missouri history. The photographs, though deteriorated, showed the cabin interior, the excavated tunnel, and the collection of personal items. One particularly unsettling image captured the smokehouse interior with its hanging meats, taken before their true nature was discovered. The clinical detachment of the black and white image somehow made it more disturbing when viewed with the knowledge of what it actually depicted. Thornton also uncovered correspondence between Sheriff Harrington and authorities in other states that hadn't been included in the official case file. Most significantly, he found a letter from the sheriff of Daviess County, Kentucky, responding to Harrington's inquiries about the Stillwell brothers. The letter dated June 3, 1868 stated, "No record of Stillwell brothers as described." However, case from 1861 bears similar patterns. Brothers Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley disappeared following accusations of grave robbing and customer poisoning at their roadside tavern. Descriptions match your suspects. Ezekiel would now be approx 37 years, Joshua 34. Both known for unusual interest in anatomy and preservation methods. Joshua worked briefly as assistant to local doctor before a dismissal for unspecified misconduct. This connection suggested the Stillwell brothers had likely been the Hartleys, who had changed their identities and relocated to Missouri during the chaos of the Civil War. Their pattern of predatory behavior had apparently begun earlier, and in another state, adding a new dimension to the case. Further research by Thornton uncovered additional details about the Hartley brothers. Newspaper archives from Kentucky revealed that the brothers had operated a small tavern called Hartley's Rest on a road between Owensboro and Hartford from 1858 to 1861. The establishment had gained a reputation for serving unusually flavorful stews and meat pies, drawing travelers, despite its remote location. In early 1861, suspicions arose when the local cemetery reported evidence of grave tampering. Around the same time, several travelers who had stopped at Hartley's Rest were reported missing by their families. Local authorities began an investigation, but before they could question the brothers thoroughly, Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley disappeared, abandoning their tavern overnight. The parallels to the Stillwell case were striking. Brothers operating a roadside establishment catering to travelers, unexplained disappearances, and a sudden vanishing act when suspicions arose. The physical descriptions and ages matched as well, supporting the theory that the Hartleys had reinvented themselves as the Stillwells and continued their predatory activities in Missouri. Thornton published his findings in the Journal of Ozark Studies in 1953, bringing renewed attention to the long, cold case. His article, Serving More Than Water, The Stillwell Brothers' Reign of Terror, presented the most complete account of the case to date, incorporating both the original investigation and his own discoveries. Following Thornton's publication, an elderly woman named Sarah Wilkes contacted him with a story passed down in her family. Her grandfather, James Wilkes, had been a member of Sheriff Harrington's search party in 1868. According to family lore, the search had uncovered more than was officially reported. Grandfather wouldn't speak of it much, her letter to Thornton stated. But on his deathbed in 1911, he told my father about a hidden room they found beneath the cabin floor, said it contained what he called instruments of torture and a chair with restraints. Sheriff Harrington ordered them not to include it in reports, to spare the families of the missing. Grandfather said he never slept right after what he saw there. This account, while impossible to verify independently, aligned with certain inconsistencies in the official records. Several pages appeared to be missing from the inventory of items found on the property with numbering that jumped from page 7 to page 11. Whether these pages were intentionally removed or lost to time remains unknown. Thornton's research also uncovered a curious detail about the brothers' disappearance. The abandoned meal on their table had included 2 plates, yet evidence suggested a third person had been present. A third chair at the table was pulled out, and a partial footprint in spilled stew was of a different size than either brother's known footwear. This led to speculation that the brothers might have been interrupted during a meal by someone who then either killed them or forced them to flee. But who this third person might have been and what their connection to the brothers was remained a mystery. Thornton's work inspired others to investigate the case. Amateur historians and true crime enthusiasts began combing through newspaper archives and county records across the Midwest, looking for any trace of the Stillwell Hartley brothers or similar crimes that might be connected to them. In 1954, a librarian in Jefferson City discovered a newspaper article from the St. Louis Bureau, Missouri Republican dated January 18, 1862, describing the arrest of 2 brothers named Harlow for suspicious behavior and possession of personal effects, not their own. The brothers were held briefly but released due to lack of evidence. The physical description matched the Stillwell Hartley brothers, suggesting they may have adopted multiple identities during their criminal career. Another researcher found records from a small town in southern Illinois indicating that 2 brothers named Stillman had operated a boarding house there for approximately 6 months in early 1863 before abruptly departing following the disappearance of a guest. Again, the descriptions matched, hinting at a pattern of movement and identity changes as the brothers stayed one step ahead of suspicion. These discoveries painted a picture of the brothers as calculating predators who had refined their methods over time, learning from each close call and becoming more careful with each new identity. By the time they established themselves in Webster County as the Stillwells, they had apparently developed a system that allowed them to prey on travelers for years without detection. In 1955, construction workers clearing land for a new highway approximately 12 miles north of the former Stillwell property made a grim discovery. While excavating a hillside, they unearthed human remains buried in a shallow grave. The remains examined by the medical examiner were determined to be those of a male in his 30s who had died approximately 90 years earlier. The cause of death was clear: a single gunshot wound to the back of the skull. With the remains was a pocket watch with the initials ES engraved on the inside of the case. This led investigators to believe they had found Elias Stillwell, apparently murdered and buried far from the cabin he had shared with his brother. The location aligned with Theodore Palmer's 1868 statement about seeing Jeremiah Stillwell riding north on December 11, 1867. Had Jeremiah killed his brother and fled? Or had some third party killed Elias and forced Jeremiah to flee? Further examination of the remains revealed additional details. The medical examiner noted that the victim's right hand was missing entirely, apparently removed post-mortem with a sharp instrument. This unusual detail seemed ritualistic rather than practical, suggesting something more complex than a simple murder. The discovery of what appeared to be Elias Stillwell's remains prompted a renewed search of the area. But no trace of Jeremiah was found. If he had continued north after burying his brother, he had left no discernible trail. No trace of Jeremiah Stillwell or Joshua Hartley was ever found. Records from port cities were checked for any sign of him leaving the country, but if he had done so, he had used yet another assumed name. In 1958, a retired sheriff from Pike County, Illinois, contacted Thornton with an intriguing lead. In 1869, approximately a year after the Stillwell brothers' disappearance, a man matching Jeremiah's description had been briefly detained in Pittsfield, Illinois for questioning regarding a suspicious death at a boarding house where he had been staying. The man, who called himself Jeremy Stilson, was released when witnesses provided him with an alibi. He left town immediately after and was never seen again. This tantalizing clue suggested that Jeremiah might have continued his predatory behavior after leaving Missouri, though perhaps with greater caution and without a partner. However, the trail went cold after Pittsfield with no further sightings or records that could be definitively linked to the missing brother. In 1967, exactly 100 years after the brothers' disappearance, the Webster County Historical Society erected a small marker near where the cabin had once stood. The plaque makes no mention of the brothers' crimes, stating only site of the Stillwell cabin, 1863-1868, scene of unsolved disappearances that haunted the Ozarks frontier. The site itself has long since returned to wilderness, the cabin having collapsed sometime in the early 1900s. Local residents still avoid the area after dark, claiming that sounds of digging can sometimes be heard on still nights, and that the well occasionally produces echoes when nothing has been dropped into it. The centennial of the case brought renewed media attention. The Springfield News Leader ran a week-long series on the Stillwell brothers, incorporating all the research and discoveries made since the original investigation. The articles sparked public interest in the case, leading to several people coming forward with family stories or documents that added minor details to the historical record. One particularly valuable contribution came from the descendants of Dr. William Hayes, the county physician who had examined the remains found on the Stillwell property. His granddaughter provided Thornton with a journal Hayes had kept, which included more detailed notes about his findings than had been included in the official reports. Hayes had written, "I am recording these observations separately from my official report, as their nature is too disturbing for public consumption. The preparation of human remains found in the smokehouse shows evidence of specialized knowledge. Most disturbingly, there's evidence that selection was not random. Certain parts were clearly preferred over others, suggesting a ritualistic or preferential aspect to the brothers' consumption patterns. These private notes confirmed what many had suspected, but few had been willing to state explicitly. The Stillwell brothers had not merely killed and robbed their victims, but had processed and consumed their remains with deliberate methodology, suggesting a level of depravity beyond simple murder for profit. The meat was not merely cut from bone, but processed with techniques one might expect from a trained butcher or medical professional. Certain organs appear to have been carefully removed and preserved separately. In 1968, a retired postal worker named Harold Weston, great-grandson of Thomas Weston, who had discovered the abandoned cabin, donated a box of his ancestors' personal papers to the Webster County Historical Society. Among these was a journal Thomas Weston had kept during his later years. An entry dated April 17, 1882, contained a startling confession. "I have carried this secret for 15 years, but find I cannot take it to my grave. What I told the sheriff about discovering the Stillwell place abandoned was not the whole truth. I had stopped there many times before, always alone, always careful. That final day, I arrived to find Elias dead at the table, his face in his stew. Jeremiah held a gun, shaking like a leaf. He said he was going to tell, said he couldn't live with it anymore. He made me help him load Elias onto a horse. We rode north together until we found a suitable place to bury him. Jeremiah gave me a gold watch and $50 to keep quiet, then said he was heading for Oregon Territory. I have not seen him since. May God forgive me for my silence and complicity." This confession, if accurate, answered some questions while raising others. It explained the abandoned meal and Elias's disappearance, but not why Jeremiah had left all his belongings behind. It also implicated Thomas Weston in a cover-up, casting doubt on other aspects of his testimony. Most significantly, it suggested a rift between the brothers that had led to violence. Elias apparently wanting to confess their crimes, with Jeremiah choosing to silence him rather than face justice. This human element added a new layer to the case, suggesting that even among such depraved individuals, conscience could occasionally surface with deadly consequences. Further entries in Weston's journal provided additional context. He wrote of having stopped at the Stillwell cabin numerous times during his postal route, often accepting meals from the brothers. "I never suspected the true nature of their stew," he wrote. "God help me. I consumed it with relish, complimenting them on its rich flavor. How many poor souls passed my lips in those meals? The thought torments me nightly." Weston also described conversations with Jeremiah after Elias's death as they rode north with the body. According to his account, Jeremiah spoke of their history, revealing that they had begun their crimes in Kentucky after their parents died, leaving them destitute. What had started as grave robbing for valuables had evolved into something far more sinister when they discovered they could profit from both the possessions and remains of their victims. He spoke of it so matter-of-factly. Weston wrote as if discussing the weather or crop prices. Said they'd perfected their methods over the years, learning which herbs would make travelers sleepy without affecting the taste of the food. He seemed proud of their efficiency, how they'd left no witnesses until Elias's conscience began to trouble him. Weston's journal ended abruptly in 1883, suggesting he may have died soon after recording these confessions. His account provided the most direct evidence, yet of what had happened to the Stillwell brothers, though it could not be independently verified a century later. Historians and crime researchers continued to debate the full truth of the Stillwell case. Some suggest that Jeremiah killed his brother to end their killing spree, perhaps developing a conscience that Elias lacked. Others propose that the brothers had an accomplice who turned on them, possibly another traveler who discovered their true nature. The most disturbing theory, supported by some evidence from the recovered papers, is that the brothers were not only killing and robbing travelers, but had developed a ritual around consuming their victims, a practice they extended to their unwitting guests by serving human flesh in their stews. Dr. Hayes's original notes included observations about certain bones showing evidence of having been broken open to extract marrow, a practice not typically used in conventional meat processing. The brothers' purchase of unusual amounts of preserving agents and spices, noted by Martha Simmons, suggests they may have been masking the true nature of the meat they served. In 1969, a team from the anthropology department at the University of Missouri examined the photographs and description of the remains found on the Stillwell property. Their analysis concluded that the processing methods used showed remarkable consistency and anatomical knowledge, supporting the theory that the brothers had developed specific techniques over time, possibly refining them through multiple iterations. The anthropologists also noted that the removal of certain body parts appeared selective, rather than random, with particular attention paid to muscle groups from the thighs, shoulders, and back, cuts that would be considered prime in traditional butchery. This selective approach suggested not only practical knowledge, but a ritualized or preferential aspect to their consumption of human flesh. The Missouri State Police officially closed the Stillwell case in 1969, classifying it as solved, despite the absence of a trial or definitive proof of what became of Jeremiah Stillwell. The official conclusion was that the brothers had killed at least 21 travelers between 1863 and 1867, robbing them of valuables and processing their remains for consumption and to dispose of evidence. Throughout the 1970s, interest in the case occasionally resurged when similar crimes were discovered elsewhere in the country. Comparisons were drawn to other historical cases of cannibalism and serial murder, with criminologists using the Stillwell case as a study in how isolated environments and transient victims created opportunities for predators to operate undetected for extended periods. In 1972, a historical researcher named Eleanor Phillips discovered an intriguing connection while examining Oregon territorial records. A man named Jerome Stillman had purchased land near Portland in 1869, establishing a small way station for travelers heading to and from the city. The physical description matched what was known of Jeremiah Stillwell, and the timing aligned with Thomas Weston's claim that Jeremiah had headed for Oregon territory. Phillips found that Stillman had operated his way station for approximately 3 years before selling the property and disappearing from records. During that time, at least 2 travelers had been reported missing after being seen heading toward his property, though no investigation appeared to have connected these disappearances to Stillman. This discovery suggested that Jeremiah might have continued his predatory behavior after fleeing Missouri, though perhaps with greater caution and a quicker willingness to move on when suspicions arose. The pattern fit with what was known of the brothers' earlier movements through Kentucky, Illinois, and Missouri, establishing themselves in relatively isolated locations, preying on travelers and relocating when necessary. However, the trail went cold after Stillman sold his Oregon property in 1872. If Jeremiah Stillwell had adopted yet another identity, He had done so without leaving records that could be connected to his previous personas. Whether he eventually faced justice, died of natural causes, or continued his crimes under another name remains unknown. The final whereabouts of Jeremiah Stilwell remain a mystery. If Thomas Weston's belated confession was accurate, Jeremiah headed to Oregon Territory. Records from that region show several men of similar description arriving between 1868 and 1870, but none who can be conclusively identified as the missing brother. In 1975, during renovations to a historical building in Sacramento, California, workers discovered a cache of documents hidden in a wall cavity. Among these was a journal belonging to a man who identified himself only as J.S. dating from 1873 to 1878. The journal described its author's life as a cook in a mining camp in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Certain passages in the journal raised disturbing parallels to the Stilwell case. The author wrote of special techniques for preparing meat and secret ingredients that made his stews particularly flavorful. He mentioned that miners occasionally disappeared from the camp, but such occurrences were common and rarely investigated thoroughly. Most tellingly, an entry from 1877 stated, "Sometimes I miss E in our cabin in the hills. He was weak at the end, but for years we perfected our craft together. The guests never suspected what nourishment they received at our table. Here, I must be more cautious, but the opportunities remain plentiful." While this journal could not be definitively linked to Jeremiah Stilwell, the similarities were striking enough that some researchers believe it provides evidence that he continued his murderous activities in California after leaving Oregon. The journal ended abruptly in October 1878, with no indication of what became of its author. The Stilwell case stands as one of the darkest chapters in Ozark history, a tale of frontier isolation, opportunistic predation, and unthinkable horror masked by simple hospitality. It reminds us that in the vast wilderness of post-Civil War America, travelers put their lives in the hands of strangers with every stop they made. Today, the land where the Stilwell cabin once stood is private property, unmarked and unvisited. The well, according to local sources, was filled in during the 1970s after several animals were found dead nearby, the water apparently contaminated by something seeping from the surrounding soil. The stretch of road that once brought travelers to the brothers' door has long since been rude. The old path barely visible now as a depression in the forest floor. Nature has reclaimed the scene of these historic horrors, covering them with new growth. But the earth remembers what happened there, even if human memory fades. In 1980, the Webster County Historical Society conducted an archaeological survey of the Stilwell property, hoping to find additional evidence that might shed light on unanswered questions. The foundation of the cabin was still visible, as were the collapsed remains of the root cellar and smokehouse. Excavation revealed few new insights, but soil samples taken from around the well showed unusually high concentrations of human bone fragments, suggesting that the brothers had disposed of remains there over an extended period. The archaeologists also found evidence of a previously undiscovered pit approximately 50 yards behind the smokehouse, which contained a layer of ash and charred bone fragments, indicating that some remains had been burned rather than processed or buried. These findings confirmed the brothers' methodical approach to disposing of evidence. They appeared to have used multiple methods, processing some remains for consumption, burying others, burning some, and disposing of yet others in the well, making it unlikely that all their victims would ever be identified or accounted for. The archaeological team also discovered a small tin box buried beneath what had been the cabin's hearth. Inside was a Dodgeray-type photograph of two young men standing beside an older couple, presumably their parents. On the back was written Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley with mother and father 1848. This confirmed the brothers' original identities and provided the only known image of them. The photograph showed two ordinary-looking young men, Ezekiel, later Elias, with a serious expression, and Joshua, later Jeremiah, with what appeared to be a slight smile. Nothing in their appearance hinted at the depravity they would later exhibit. A reminder that monsters often wear unremarkable faces. In a final eerie postscript to this case, a historian researching Missouri Civil War records in 1961 discovered that a Union patrol had briefly stopped at a cabin matching the Stillwell property's location in October 1863. Shortly after the brothers had established themselves there, the patrol leader report mentioned accepting a meal from two Kentucky men recently settled, and noted that 3 of his men fell ill afterward, though all recovered. Had this been an early unsuccessful attempt by the brothers to claim victims? If so, it suggests their methodology evolved over time, becoming more effective and leaving fewer survivors to raise alarms. The patrol leader, Lieutenant James Melee, wrote that he found the brothers oddly hospitable given the tensions in the region, and noted that their cabin seemed unusually well appointed for men so recently settled. He described a meal of hearty stew, with meat of indeterminate origin, and observed that the brothers seemed disappointed when the patrol announced their intention to continue their journey, rather than camp for the night. This account, combined with the brothers' known history in Kentucky, suggests that they had arrived in Missouri with their murderous intentions already formed, wasting little time in attempting to continue their predatory activities. The fact that the patrol members survived might indicate that the brothers were still refining the herbs or poisons they later used to incapacitate their victims. In 1985, a doctoral student researching historical criminal psychology interviewed several elderly residents of Webster County who had grown up hearing stories about the Stillwell brothers. One recurring theme in these accounts was the brothers' apparent interest in folk medicine and herbal preparations. Martha Apprentice, when 93 at the time of the interview, recalled stories her grandmother had told her. Grandma said the younger brother would come to town asking about plants that grow in these hills, had particular interest in ones that caused drowsiness or confusion, claimed it was for helping with his brother's headaches, but folks later wondered if they weren't using those plants on their visitors. This interest in medicinal or poisonous plants aligned with the brothers' known background. Joshua Hartley had worked briefly as a doctor's assistant in Kentucky before being dismissed, potentially gaining knowledge of both anatomy and pharmaceuticals. The brothers may have combined this formal knowledge with local folk traditions to develop methods for subduing their victims without struggle. Analysis of the brothers' purchasing patterns at Martha Simmons's general store showed regular acquisition of herbs and substances that, while individually innocuous, could potentially be combined to create sedative compounds. Items like valerian root, certain mushroom varieties, and large quantities of alcohol could have been used to create preparations that would make travelers drowsy or compliant. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Stillwell case is not what we know, but what remains unknown. How many travelers simply vanished on those remote Ozark roads, their disappearances never connected to the murderous brothers? How many families never learned the fate of loved ones who set out on journeys and never arrived? And somewhere, perhaps descendants of Jeremiah Stillwell live on unaware of their ancestors' dark legacy or carrying secrets of their own. In 1992, the case received renewed attention when a true crime author published The Stillwell Brothers, America's Forgotten Predators, a comprehensive examination of the case incorporating all known evidence and theories. The book became a regional bestseller and sparked interest in the case among a new generation. Following the book's publication, a woman from Northern California contacted the author with an intriguing family story. Her great-grandfather had operated a boarding house in Sacramento in the late 1870s. Among his tenants was a middle-aged man who worked as a cook at various establishments around the city. This man, who called himself John Smith, was described as polite but reclusive. According to family lore, Smith died suddenly in 1879 of what appeared to be a stroke. When the boarding house owner cleaned out his room, he found a locked trunk containing various personal items, including several watches, rings, and other valuables that seemed inconsistent with Smith's modest lifestyle. Also in the trunk was a journal containing entries that disturbed the boarding house owner so deeply that he burned it after reading only a few pages. The woman believed, based on the timing and description, that John Smith might have been Jeremiah Stilwell in his final identity. While this connection cannot be proven, it presents a plausible end to Jeremiah's story. Dying anonymously in California, his true identity and horrific crimes known only to himself. If this account is accurate, it suggests that Jeremiah Stilwell eluded justice throughout his life, taking the full truth of his crimes to his grave. The known victims represent only those who could be connected to the brothers through the evidence found at their Missouri cabin, likely a fraction of their total victims across multiple states and identities. The sound of water still echoes in that deep well, even filled with earth. The whispers of the past never truly fade in places where such darkness once dwelled. For those who know the story, passing through the Missouri Ozarks still brings a shiver of awareness, a reminder that not all who offered hospitality to weary travelers did so with pure intentions. In 2004, an episode of a popular television series on historical crimes featured the Stilwell case, bringing it to national attention. The show included interviews with historians, criminologists, and descendants of Webster County residents who had been involved in the original investigation. One particularly poignant segment featured an elderly woman whose great-grandfather had disappeared while traveling through Missouri in 1866. His name had been found in the Stilwell ledger, confirming a family suspicion that had persisted for generations. "All these years we wondered what happened to him," she said. "Now we know, though the truth is more horrible than anything we imagined." The Stilwell brothers' crimes, while shocking, were made possible by the unique conditions of their time and place. The post-Civil War frontier offered perfect conditions for predators, isolated locations, transient populations, limited law enforcement, and the chaos of a society rebuilding after conflict. Travelers often had no choice but to rely on the hospitality of strangers, creating vulnerability that the brothers exploited mercilessly. Their methodology, offering food and shelter to weary travelers, using their victims' remains as food for subsequent victims, collecting trophies in their hidden chamber, suggests a level of depravity that transcends simple financial motivation. While they certainly profited from their crimes, taking valuables from their victims, the brothers seem to have derived a more profound satisfaction from their power over life and death and from their secret knowledge of what they were serving their guests. Criminologists who have studied the case note that the brothers' behavior shows elements of what would now be classified as serial killing, though with pragmatic components unusual in modern cases. Their preference for travelers as victims shows an understanding of opportunity and risk management that allowed them to operate undetected for years. The fact that they served their victims' remains to subsequent travelers adds a layer of psychological complexity that continues to disturb those who study the case. Was this practical disposal of evidence a perverse form of humor, or something more ritualistic? The brothers left no explicit explanation of their motivations, leaving researchers to speculate based on their actions and the few writings that survived. Today, the Stilwell case is taught in criminology classes as an example of historical serial murder and as a demonstration of how different environmental factors can shape criminal behavior. The isolated setting, the transient nature of the victims, and the limited forensic capabilities of the era created conditions that would be difficult to replicate in modern times. Yet, the fundamental horror of the case remains timeless. The violation of the sacred trust between host and guest, the exploitation of human vulnerability, and the revelation that monsters often wear human faces, offering water to the thirsty and rest to the weary, while harboring unimaginable darkness within. The land where the Stilwell cabin once stood has been reclaimed by nature. The physical evidence of their crimes, long since decayed or removed. But the story endures, a cautionary tale passed down through generations, a reminder of humanity's capacity for both hospitality and horror. And somewhere in the Missouri Ozarks, where the old road once passed, travelers still sometimes report an unexplained unease, a sudden chill in the air. As if the land itself remembers what transpired there, brothers who served more than water to weary travelers whose true legacy was written in blood and bone, rather than historical records. For those who know the tale, the lesson remains clear. Not all who offer shelter from the storm have benevolent intentions. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who smile and invite you in from the cold, offering a hot meal and a place to rest your head.